capitalism and freedom, free to choose. So that's why I've taken to calling them right-wing Trotskyists, because they have this, and mostly because it annoys them, but also because they have this same sort of frozen in time quality. You know, it's not, 1917, but it's definitely 1982. Now, the left-wing trots don't have very much money, as you know. They make their money selling newspapers outside of events like this. The right-wing trots have a lot of money. They build think tanks in Washington, D.C., and they want to build a $200 million Milton Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago. Now, this brings up an interesting point. It's an interesting point about the think tanks in general, which has to do with the fact that it does seem to take so much corporate welfare to keep these ideas alive, which would seem to be a contradiction of the core principle of free market ideology. I mean, and particularly now in the context of the Milton Friedman Institute. I mean, I could see it in the 90s, but now, is the world really clamoring for this? Is there really a demand that you are supplying here? Really? I think this points to a larger issue, and this has come up for me again and again in talking about this ideology, this ideological campaign. Is it really fueled by true belief, or is it just fueled by greed? Because it's not. The thoughts are so very profitable, so they are distinctive in that way. Distinctive from other ideologies. And of course, certainly we know that religion has been a great economic partner in imperialism. I mean, this isn't an entirely new phenomenon, but this is a question that comes up a lot. And I think it's very difficult to answer, and it's clear, certainly at this school, that much of it is fueled by belief, by true belief, by falling in love with those elegant systems. But I think we also need to look particularly at this moment, who this ideology benefits directly, economically, keeping it alive in this moment, and how even in this moment, when everybody is saying, this is the end of market fundamentalism, because we're seeing this betrayal of the basic tenets of the non-interventionist government by the Bush administration, I believe this is a myth, and that the ideology has just gone dormant because it ceased to be useful. But it will come roaring back, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I was interested that yesterday the Heritage Foundation, which has always been a staunch Friedmanite think tank, that they came out in favor of the bailout. They came out in favor of the bailout. They said it was vital. And what's interesting about that is, of course, the bailout is creating a crisis in the public sphere. It's taking a private crisis, a crisis on Wall Street, which of course isn't restricted to Wall Street. It will affect everyone. But it is moving those bad debts onto the public books. And now the Bush administration has already left the next administration, whoever it is, with an economic crisis on their hands. But with this proposed transfer, they're dramatically increasing that crisis. So we can count, I would argue, on the Heritage Foundation refinding their faith when it becomes necessary and useful to once again argue that the way to revive the American economy is to cut taxes, cut regulation, to stimulate the economy. And by the way, we can't afford Social Security. We're going to have to privatize it because we've got this terrible debt and deficit on our hands. So the ideology is far from dead. And what we are, I think, seeing with this proposed monument to Friedmanism is really a way of entrenching it and making sure that it is always available to come back, to come roaring back. So I said I would talk a little bit about Friedmanism and the links to the current crisis. And it's pretty direct. Milton Friedman is pretty much accepted as the godfather of deregulation. And this ideology was the rationale for turning the financial sector into the casino that we see today. You know, Milton Friedman was very clear about this. He believed that history took a wrong turn, and that's a quote. It's a quote from a letter he wrote to Augusto Pinochet. He said, "History took a wrong turn in your country as well as mine." And he was referring to the responses to the Great Depression. And in Chile, it was the rise of import substitution and developmentalism. But in the United States, he was, of course, referring to the New Deal. And I think that the Chicago School of Economics is properly understood as a counter-revolution against the New Deal, against regulations like Glass-Steagall that was put in place in 1934 after having seen people lose their life savings to the market crash. And it was a firewall, a very simple, sensible law that said if you want to be an investment bank, if you want to gamble with your investors' money, but the government isn't going to help you because it's your own risk. You can fail. And if you want to be a commercial bank, then we will help you. We will offer insurance to make sure that those savings are safe, but you have to restrict the risks that you take. You cannot gamble. You cannot be an investment bank. And a firewall was put up between investment banks and consumer banks. And now we look at the way in which this crisis is supposedly being solved, and what we see actually is a wave of mergers in the banking sector. A wave of mergers with the banks getting bigger and bigger until ultimately, you know, the Financial Times was predicting today that eventually the United States will have 3 big banks, just like Japan does. That's where it's heading. And of course, all of those banks will be too big to fail. So they all have this implicit guarantee. It's not just Fannie and Freddie. It's any function that is too important to fail has this implicit guarantee. Phil Gramm is the person, you know, on the legislative side who did the most to create the legislative context for what we're seeing right now in the financial sector. You know, I think everyone knows that Phil Gramm most famously recently is the one who said that America was in a mental recession and a bunch of whiners and all of that. And so he's not, you know, officially an advisor to McCain, but there is talk that if he were to win the elections, he would be Treasury Secretary. You know, I bring him up because, you know, Phil Gramm was a Milton Friedman fanatic. I think you know this. In 1999, the same year that he led the charge to strike down Glass-Steagall, he also, Phil Gramm, pressed Congress to get the Medal of Honor for Friedman. When he ran, when he made his 1996 presidential run, McCain was the co-chair of his campaign. Phil Gramm was asked if you had to rely on a single person as your foremost economic policy advisor, who would it be? And he replied, Dr. Milton Friedman. So we see the connections between deregulation and Friedmanism. I also think there's something else at play in the kind of politicians that are attracted to this particular ideology. You know, Reagan was the first really to embrace it. Nixon was the great disappointment to Friedman. I'm sure you all know that. You know, he writes in his memoir that when Nixon was elected, he was euphoric. I mean, he couldn't imagine an American president more closely aligned ideologically than Richard Nixon. But Richard Nixon insisted on governing, and he wanted to win elections, and he imposed wage and price controls, and Milton Friedman sort of had a bit of a temper tantrum and declared him the most socialist president in modern American history. But you know, it was really Reagan who campaigned, you know, with his copy of Capitalism and Freedom on the campaign trail, who was the first person to really put Friedmanism into practice. And I raise this because, you know, one of the things that we that we hear about McCain is that he doesn't really know about economics. And so I think that makes us inclined not to take his economic ideas seriously, not to think he would be a really serious economic force. I think just the opposite. And I think if you look at his campaign platform, you see just the opposite. He wants to privatize Social Security. He is saying that in the first 100 days, they'll look at every single government